What's happening at the United Nations right now should have every gun owner paying attention, because what took place in New York last week wasn't just another international meeting, it was a glimpse into what could be the next major strategy being used against the firearms industry and the Second Amendment community as a whole. So let's get into it. From June 1st to June 5th, the United Nations held what's known as a 9th biennial meeting of states to discuss the implementation of its program of action on small arms and light weapons. Now, that may sound like a lot of bureaucratic jargon or whatever, but what happened behind the scenes could have major implications for firearm manufacturers, distributors, retailers, and even businesses that simply work with the firearms industry. Before the meeting even began, delegates were handed a draft document that included language targeting the firearms industry. One of the most concerning proposals called for the creation of an industry code of conduct. At first glance, that might not sound all that bad, may not sound alarming at all, but critics argue that language like this could be used to hold not only gun manufacturers responsible for criminal misuse of firearms, but to potentially everyone involved in the legal supply chain. Now think about that for just a second. We are talking about manufacturers, importers, exporters, shipping companies, banks, insurance providers, even payment processors. Under this theory, if a firearm is later used in a crime somewhere in the world, anti-gun advocates could argue that everyone involved in the lawful transfer of that firearm shares responsibility. And that's exactly why many in the firearms community are sounding the alarm. The concern is that if activists can't directly ban the lawful firearms industry, they may try to make doing business with the industry so legally risky that companies simply decide it's not worth the hassle. So in other words, isolate the firearms industry economically without ever passing a formal ban. But that wasn't the only issue on the table. Delegates also pushed forward efforts related to firearm marking and tracing standards. Buried within the outcome document was language welcoming a UN study that could be used in the future to justify expanding international marking requirements on firearms. Supporters argue it's about tracing crime guns. Critics worry it could become the foundation for additional regulations and restrictions down the road. And then there was a launch of a brand new UN initiative called the Open-Ended Technical Experts Group. This group has been tasked with developing recommendations to approve implementation of the UN's firearm-related programs. Translated into plain English, they're working on recommendations that could eventually become new international standards affecting the firearms industry. What's especially concerning to many observers is who gets a seat at that table. And according to attendees, industry representatives with the real-world experience in firearm design and manufacturing were largely excluded from participating in that discussion. Instead, presentations were dominated by academics, advocacy organizations, and government officials discussing concerns over things like modern firearms, polymer frames, and 3D printing technology. Critics argue that many of these conversations took place in an environment where relatively few participants had practical experience with the technology being discussed. But perhaps the most controversial moment came during negotiations over the final outcome document. The United States delegation objected to several provisions and requested votes on disputed language. Under normal circumstances, that would require member nations to formally record their positions. Instead, according to reports from the meeting, UN attorneys provided a legal interpretation that prevented those votes from taking place. Now, the United States ultimately objected to the adoption of the document as a whole. Nevertheless, the document moved forward and was adopted. And then came a comment that has generated significant attention. As delegates were leaving, a senior official from the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs reportedly walked past the US delegation and remarked, "We have lawyers." Now, whether that statement was intended as a joke, a boast, or something else entirely, many observers viewed it as a symbolic of larger concern that procedural maneuvering is increasingly being used to achieve outcomes that might not otherwise have broad consensus. Regardless of where you stand on international firearms policy, one thing is clear. This was not just about one single meeting. This wasn't just about one document. What happened in New York appears to be part of a much larger effort to expand liability theories, develop new international standards, and increase pressure on the firearms industry through regulatory and legal mechanisms. And according to the chair of the newly formed experts group, This process, it's only getting started. So, what do you think? Are these legitimate efforts to combat illicit firearms trafficking? Or are we watching the early stages of a broader campaign that could eventually impact lawful firearm ownership and commerce? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you have found this report helpful, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future updates. And we will see you in the next one.